been devastated by the news of another of our beloved politicians brutally murdered. After Sir David Amess and Joe Cox, now Anne Whitikham has been savagely killed in her home. All three died without any protection. This is unacceptable for a country with a £1.2 trillion annual budget. An attack on a politician is an assault on democracy itself. Anne was without doubt one of this country's most formidable and courageous politicians. She inspired me and countless others. She was unwavering in her belief, and she made Britain a better place. I can only imagine what her family is going through, and my heart goes out to them. I cannot tell you why Anne was killed. That is for the police and the courts. What I can tell you is that counter-terrorism police are investigating her murder as a suspected act of terrorism. And I can tell you about the climate in which she was killed. A relentless narrative from politicians and the media that Reform UK is a threat to be urgently stopped. A narrative so relentless it constitutes incitement. And why are we targeted like this? Because we say things that are unfashionable among many in Westminster, but are popular in the country at large. Let me start with the most prominent. And it's incredibly difficult to repeat these words that have been said of our late friend, our late treasure, Anne. But we cannot ever allow this to happen again. And so I must. David Lammy, now the Deputy Prime Minister, described Anne as a, quote, poisonous bigot who wants to, quote, drag us back to the 19th century and, quote, throw minorities out in the cold on the way. He boldly declared, quote, we must stand up to them before it's too late. Before it's too late. Wes Streeting, until recently the Health Secretary, said, quote, if only science had a cure for Anne Whitcombe. A woman on Twitter said, quote, Anne Whitcombe better go this week. She is a little fascist beast. This woman happens to have been, until just a few months ago, the Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, Jess Phillips. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, made the inflammatory declaration that, quote, the greatest threat to the Britain we love doesn't come from Tehran or Moscow. It comes from within. I'm talking about Nigel Farage. People with poison on British soil. The Iranian regime has attempted multiple terrorist attacks on British soil. Is it any wonder, with such rhetoric relentlessly levelled at reform, that some may be moved to try to eliminate that supposed threat through lethal violence? Lisa Nandy, Labour's Culture Secretary, was asked whether Reform were fascists. She responded, quote, if it walks like a duck. The chairman of the Conservative Party likened Reform to Nazis. Instead of sacking him, the leader of the Conservative Party said he was, quote, being funny. Ms Badenoch, nothing about comparing anyone at Reform to Nazis is funny. Keir Starmer described Reform policies as, quote, racist and immoral. Wes Streeting insisted that Reform was dangerous, nationalistic, and, quote, using propaganda reminiscent of the 1930s. And Lucy Powell described Mr Farage as, quote, a threat to democracy. Look, these are a tiny fraction of countless examples. And keep in mind that the views Reform UK espouse are anything but niche. Our party has led over 350 national opinion polls in a row. And then there's the media. In the run-up to the 2024 general election, the BBC was forced to apologise to Richard Tice for calling reform far-right. Just a few weeks ago, the BBC had to apologise to Nigel Farage for falsely claiming he said people should respond to the body cam footage of Henry Novak's murder with, quote, white cold rage. And the aftermath of Anne's death only serves as an appalling case study of the trends that I am describing. It was on the morning of the 10th of July that we learned of the devastating news that Anne Widdecombe had passed away. 9 hours then passed before we discovered it was being treated as murder. During those hours, some in the media appeared gleeful. Adam Bolton appeared on Sky News, referring to Anne as a spinster and an old maid. Peter Tatchell called her a bigot. This was after they learned she was dead. After arresting and releasing a man, the police then arrested a 28-year-old man who lived in South Yorkshire. By Saturday night, we knew that Anne, a high-profile Reform UK politician, had been murdered, and the chief suspect was a man who had driven over 300 miles to her house. We knew that nothing had been stolen. Yet with all this in the public domain, the police, the authorities and the media repeatedly appeared to all but rule out the idea that this could be a politically motivated attack. On the 12th of July, the BBC ran the headline, "Police say no suggestion of political motive in Anne Widdecombe killing after new arrest." That same day, the Guardian's headline was, quote, "Nothing to suggest Anne Widdecombe death politically motivated." Now, at this stage, it was obvious something was not adding up. Reform MPs were devastated with grief for the loss of their friend, rocked by the shock of the brutality of her murder. But candidly, they were also fearful. Fearful for their lives, fearful for the lives of their families. And when Nigel made the obvious point that he could see the attack was premeditated, a possibility any serious person had to confront, the media hounded him for it. The Guardian ran the headline, "Police warn Widdecombe murder speculation is unhelpful and distressing." The Times worked with a former Tory MP to run the headline, "Nigel Farage accused of using Anne Widdecombe's death as propaganda." Former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith took the opportunity to condemn Nigel, declaring, quote, "Anne's death is not an Agatha Christie novel." As time has passed, Nigel's assertion appears to have been well-founded, and those who attacked him have been proven to be, well, I'll let viewers be the judge. And I'm afraid the police's conduct has also been called into question. Jonathan Hall, KC, the government's own counter-terrorism advisor, has said, quote, "I don't understand why Devon and Cornwall police were steering the public away from the idea that this was a terrorist case, and I don't know why they didn't simply say they had an open mind as to the motivation. I think they probably broke one of the golden rules of investigations, which is not to comment on live investigations in case new facts emerge." Now, counter-terrorism police are investigating what they describe as a targeted attack on Anne. The leader of our party lives his life under the ever-present threat of mortal danger. He has received 1,577 threats since February this year, including 597 death threats. The most persistent individual targeting Nigel sent 6 directed threats to him on Facebook between June the 24th and July the 6th, including a message telling him to, quote, "Get the F out of Wales before I just kill Nigel Farage. You can die at any effing moment." Another individual posted on X last month saying, quote, "Execute Nigel Farage today," today in all caps, followed by 2 further escalating posts within 8 hours. A third individual wrote on X, quote, "Can someone shoot Nigel Farage? Make him a self-fulfilling prophecy." In fact, social media is awash with threats to kill Nigel. Such threats have been ever present for years, yet astonishingly, last autumn, just days after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the authorities took the decision to cut the size of Nigel's security detail by 75%. Then the government sent David Lammy out to declare that Nigel, quote, flirted with the Hitler Youth. Reform donors thankfully stepped in, and the party covered the cost of a security detail the same size as before, commensurate with the enormous threat. This Labour government has since moved to cap funding in a manner designed to surgically choke off Reform's largest sources of funding. Make of that what you will. During the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, Sarah Pochin's office was subjected to at least 9 incidents, including Nazi stickers placed on the building, eggs thrown at the door, threatening visits from members of the public, and an Antifa presence 2 days before polling day. Since her election, multiple specific online threats have been passed to police. The most serious current threat comes from militant transgender activist group Bash Back, that has a published direct action guide explicitly targeting MPs who speak on gender issues. The guide instructs supporters to identify targets and, quote, hit repeatedly until they desist. Hit repeatedly until they desist. Dame Andrea Jenkins, the Reform Mayor for Lincolnshire, has received regular death and rape threats. In fact, there are so many it would take an entire press conference to go through them. But one said, quote, I hope your little boy is molested and raped by refugees, and Hamas will come after you. The toll of threats and death threats is severe enough for politicians themselves, but what often really gets to them is the thought of their families being at risk. Whatever the dangers, however unfair, the politician makes the choice to thrust themselves into the public eye. This is not the case for their partners and their children. And it is in this context that a few weeks ago, an extremely worried father begged the editor of The Times not to publish a photo of his daughter's home. Thanks to modern AI tools, the photo would make locating a home as easy as a Google search for those who sought its location. And as I've laid out, there are far too many who would. Despite the pleas of this concerned father, The Times published the photo of his daughter's house anyway. The name of that concerned, now devastated father is Nigel Farage. What possible public interest could there be in publishing a photo of Nigel's daughter's home? Days later, as Nigel Farage returned from America, he was met at the airport by a camera crew sent by Sky News. And this came shortly after Nigel's daughter's home had been approached by Sky. The very thing he feared, the very thing he begged the Times to prevent from happening, was coming to pass. His response was a terse exchange with the reporter. And even then, the media and the political class rounded on him. A columnist in The Guardian insisted Mr. Farage was, quote, clearly rattled, and that a man had, quote, exploited race as a populist issue, coded as immigration, was on his, quote, last fling. The Mirror insisted Mr. Farage was, quote, rattled. A Conservative MP insisted he was, quote, rattled. Notice the same word deployed simultaneously across newspapers and parliamentarians. Well, what you saw in that video was indeed unusual for Nigel. He was not his normal, composed self. But that was not a man who was rattled. What you saw in that footage was the righteous anger of a loving father who, having received 597 death threats since February, was worried sick about his daughter, whose safety had been put in jeopardy for no good reason at all by the Times. The fact is this: many politicians and members of the media are effectively stopping the function of democracy by creating an environment of such hostility for reform and making it unpalatably dangerous to air perfectly reasonable views. That needs to end. Those who question Nigel Farage's need for security should stop. Politicians from other parties are perfectly entitled to disagree with our policies and criticise them. They are, of course, free to criticise us. But they must stop equating us to murderous regimes that butchered tens of millions of people and committed some of the greatest horrors in history. The media should prosecute their role in holding all politicians to account, without stooping to endangering them or their families. And we must now ask ourselves if we wish to be a country which has a functioning democracy. Reform believes in Britain. We believe without a functioning democracy, there is no Britain. Now, for us to have one, politicians must be free to argue their opinions without fear of being murdered for them. Just as Sir David Amess was. Just as Joe Cox was. And now our dear Anne has been killed in her home. Enough is enough. I do not want to see politicians, regardless of party, fearing for their lives for speaking their mind. I do not want to see the hounding of families, the publication of their homes. I do not want to see another politician killed in this country. I do not want to see what happened to Anne happen ever again. This has to stop. I will close by announcing a new reform policy. If Reform win the next general election, as Home Secretary, I will ensure that all members of Parliament, of all parties, are provided with round-the-clock protection. We will also allocate significant new resources to protect former politicians still active in public life. No matter how much I, Nigel, Richard, or anyone else may disagree with your views, if you are an MP, you must be able to air them without fear. An attack on one politician is an assault on our democracy itself. Knowing Anne as I did, I know she would agree. Thank you. Okay, let's move to some questions. The first one comes from Olivia Utley, GB News.
Do you think the police is now biased against the Reform Party? And if so, do you think your voters should be able to trust the police?
Well, look, I don't have evidence that the police are biased against the Reform Party. I think trust in the police, and this isn't just my opinion, we see this in poll after poll, is worryingly low. I think it's at multi-year, maybe multi-decade lows. And that's a problem because we have a police service in this country that is designed to operate with the consent of the British people. And when we see things like what we saw with the body cam footage of Henry Novak's tragic murder, when we see what people often would describe, frankly, as gaslighting in the initial response from authorities, and without doubt differential responses depending on, for example, the ethnicity of the suspect, I don't think that's helpful. So the vast majority of our police officers are incredible people who put their lives on the line to keep us all safe, and I'm hugely grateful to them. My inbox is full of people, and I've spoken to many serving police officers and former police officers who are, frankly, aghast about some of the things that have happened. The thing that really concerns us are these police race action plans that were introduced, ironically, after the death of George Floyd in America, that do embed, clearly, structural anti-white prejudice, for example, where the police are literally being trained to not be colourblind, to not treat people the same, to treat differences in outcome as a problem in and of themselves. Those are literally inside the plans. This isn't speculation. And that's why we've said a Reform government would immediately scrap those race action plans. We need to have one rule of law for everybody in this country, and we need the police, yes, to be colourblind, to treat everybody the same, regardless of their background or ethnicity. Alex Forsyth, BBC.
Thank you very much. It seems to me you're making the argument that some of the language that's used in politics is directly endangering Reform MPs. I wonder, therefore, where you would draw the line when it comes to what is robust political argument and what is, in your words, insightful language, because some of the words you've used lately, calling the Prime Minister sick and depraved, saying the Tories are open borders lunatics who deserve their extinction, accusing them of betrayal, traitors, they're sick arsonists. Where is the line? And will you look at the language that you and your party use if you're asking other parties to do the same?
Yeah, so I draw a difference. So if you use the word traitor, for example, the definition of traitor is somebody who is engaged in betrayal. And as far as I'm concerned, it is demonstrable that, for example, the Conservative Party has acted in betrayal of the people who voted for them. And I'm not going to make this, an attack on the Conservative Party right now in this answer, but that is demonstrable. I think there's a clear difference between some of the things you've read out there And if we're comparing them not to the obvious death threats, obviously we can't compare those things. I think those are clear for anybody in this room. Those are not controversial. But comparing them to some of the comments from existing members of the government, by the way, likening reform to the Nazis, likening reform to the fascists, regimes that are clearly the most brutal and horrific in history, and saying that they pose an urgent threat that need to be stopped, I think those are in a different category. Harry Horton, ITV.
Thank you very much. Just on a similar theme, you're not known for someone who pulls your punches. I wonder in recent days whether you've reflected on your own choice of language in recent years and whether you think perhaps all politicians, including yourself, need to tone things down a little bit. And then just secondly, if I may, there were allegations this weekend that George Cotterill, volunteers for your party, as you say, used his personal credit card to pay for some computer tools and software used in this office. What can you say about that? Are those allegations true?
Yeah, so look, the first question, I certainly would not say that I would not count myself as immune to any of this. I think the points that I've made in this speech should apply to everybody. I think some of the things that Alex Forsyth just read out, I think they are in a totally different category to just some of the examples that I've given. I reiterate, if you compare Reform MPs, who, by the way, are objectively espousing views that are popular in this country, as evidenced by opposition in the polls, to the most murderous and barbaric regimes in human history, and saying that they're an urgent threat to be stopped, I do think that crosses the line. In terms of the second question, respectfully, this press conference is about life and death matters, and it's about Anne, and it's about the safety of MPs. So, you can put that to the press team, and they'll come back to you. Kemin Zeram, Channel 4.
Thanks, Mr. Yusuf. Firstly, could you update us as far as you can on the security situation as you see it right now? Has Mr. Farage had an opportunity to meet Ravek? Is there anything you can say about whether any overtures have been made by the state to either Reform HQ or your MPs about additional security now? Are there more state-funded, i.e. we pay for them, security people here? And lastly, the policy that you've just outlined that you will aim to bring in should you become a government, how much will that cost?
Sure. So in terms of the current situation with state protection for Reform MPs, there has been some movement in the very near past. I'm not going to comment on that, but suffice to say, I think particularly in light of new information, I'm pleased to say the threats are being taken seriously. So that I will say, and we're grateful for that. In terms of the cost, look, the cost of providing round-the-clock protection for members of Parliament, for all members of Parliament, we estimate to be around about £100 million. But I will say this, even if it is more, not only does this country have a £1.2 trillion annual budget, you may have seen reports that the British government plans to spend £40 billion on refurbishing Parliament. What's the point in a beautifully refurbished Parliament if those legislating within it are either dead or fearful for their lives? So as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the rare occasions in government. It should be no expense spared, and I will go to the wall on that.
And has Mr. Farage met Ravek?
I'm not going to comment on that. I will leave that to him to share that as and well he feels ready. Rob Powell, Sky News.
Thank you, Rob Powell, Sky News. On your new policy, you talked about potentially upping resources for former politicians who are still in the public eye. That's a potentially very, very big group of people if you look across all the parties. I just wondered if you could flesh out practically what sort of security you think that group should have, because it could be a very big job for the government, for the state to take on. And just secondly, you talked a little bit about donation rules as well. Are you suggesting that rules around party political donations should be loosened so that political parties are better able to provide security privately?
So in terms of the first question, yes, it is quite a large group of people, well aware of that. Yes, it will cost money, well aware of that. But I maintain we do not have a functioning democracy in the United Kingdom if MPs feel that they, again, of all parties, I want to be crystal clear, the policy response we are proposing, and I've actually advocated for some time, is for all MPs of all parties, and it will be based in terms of former politicians. It will, of course, risk assessments will form a part of it. But, the threshold at which point that security becomes necessary under a reform government will be much, much lower than it is currently, based on the things that I have seen within our party. In terms of your second question, look, the point I'm making is that we have seen the government in recent months move to legislate to choke off funding for reform. And, they will put their reasons forward for why they're doing that, but they haven't really hidden it. They've been pretty explicit about what they're doing. And what I would say is, if you dramatically reduce, as they seem to be intent on doing, dramatically reduce the ability for parties to raise funding, then the ability for that party to step in and provide security for its personnel is severely limited. And I don't think that's good for democracy. I don't think that's good for this country, regardless of which political party you support. I'm sure you could speak to members of the Green Party, for example, who would share, I know this is true actually, there are many MPs who are deeply concerned about the level of security that is provided for them and their families. So I think this is something that does need to be done. Bethany Dawson, LBC.
Hi. Would you just speak to the specifics that you think need to change when it comes to MP security? You say they need round-the-clock security, but, there are sort of panic alarms that MPs carry with them constantly. And within your plans, would you do anything specifically to protect female MPs? As you've said, there are some really horrifying sort of differences in the abuse that women face.
Yeah. So in terms of just to address that latter one, I would agree. I can only go off my own experience. I don't have access to government intelligence, but some of the things that female politicians within reform, who I consider close friends, have to receive is frankly demonic. And actually, I couldn't even. Some of the things going. I mean, it was a pretty harrowing thing to even put this speech together, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. So yes, is the answer to that. I'm sorry, your first question?
Just specificities to what you think needs to change.
Yeah, so look, I will make a few points as someone who is pretty security conscious. I've seen online and both among commentators and in the media the words protection and security used interchangeably. And so people say, when I say the state's not providing protection, people say, well, that's not true. Look, they're providing security. They're checking your CCTV. They provided you with a direct phone line to the police. Protection and security are not the same thing. No CCTV camera has ever prevented somebody being murdered. All the CCTV camera does is record crime. Likewise, a telephone number to the police, well, we've all got one of those. Let's be realistic about that. And if anyone thinks that if somebody, in a premeditated fashion, sets out to murder an MP, is going to be stopped by somebody making a phone call, direct line or not, I think that's for the birds. And so what I'm talking about is protection with a foundation of intelligence. That's what demonstrates that you're taking it seriously. And by the way, that's very expensive, yes. There's no doubt about that. It is expensive, and I make no bones about this. This is one area of politics and government spending where I think it should be no expense spared, regardless of which political party the MP represents. So I think that's an important point, and I think some of the discussion around these issues, I sit there reading it, and frankly, sometimes it just makes me angry, because the idea, if somebody is saying, I'm receiving multiple death threats, people are threatening to murder and rape my children repeatedly, and they're being told, stop complaining, the police, quote, know where your house is, direct quote from one media commentator, and we provided you with a direct line to the police should you need it, I think that's frankly insulting. Michael Knowles at The Express.
Thank you. What contact did Reform expect from the police and MI5 in the wake of Anne Widdecombe's death, given that detectives are now looking at whether other Reform politicians were being targeted? And do you think they are doing enough to tackle the threat of left-wing extremism and left-wing terrorism?
Yeah. So I want to start by just saying we obviously don't yet know for sure what the motive was around this. Around Anne's tragic murder, so I'm going to talk in generalities. Look, The first point I would make is if you're taking threats seriously and you're operating on a balance of probabilities basis and you're talking about life and death, and in the wake of a brutal murder, I think it pays to err on the side of caution. And so, look, I'll speak for myself. If I was the Home Secretary of this country and, a high-profile former politician with outspoken views had been brutally murdered, even without any further information than that, I would, on a precautionary basis, out of an abundance of caution, ratchet up in a pretty serious way, at least on a temporary basis, protection for her colleagues, especially if I knew that her colleagues were in receipt of thousands and thousands of threats and hundreds of death threats every year. Why? Because maybe you'd say there's a 90% chance it's not necessary. If there was a 1% chance that it was necessary, it's still the correct course of action, is it not? And when Reform HQ, when our security team learned that Anne had been brutally murdered, they moved quickly with the resources they had, which is obviously not the same as the resources the police or the authorities would have, but they moved incredibly quickly to provide round-the-clock protection for the Reform MPs. And I am absolutely going to draw a contrast between those two things. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, of course, the police did not have all of the facts. And I'm just giving you my own personal view here, and I would compare those two things. And I want to stress this too. My answer would be exactly the same. Obviously, the fact that it's Anne, it's our friend, and our colleague makes this all the harder. But I think my judgment's clear on this, that I can say with my hand on my heart, I would do that regardless of which political party we were talking about. And, as I said, in terms of threats being taken seriously, well, the fact that there is an organisation called Bash Back that is directing those who follow it to, I'm paraphrasing, but hit repeatedly until they desist. If an MP talks about gender issues, that probably speaks for itself, I would say. Charles Hymas, The Telegraph.
You obviously talked about politicians, but also on a local level with councillors and also staff working for political parties. Would they be included in any review that you did about whether they needed protection? And then also you talk about incitement. Do you believe that the incitement of other politicians crossed the criminal threshold? And thirdly, have you yourself, if you want to share, had any threats?
So I don't want to discuss my own situation. In terms of councillors, look, of course there are threats to councillors. And again, just to be clear, not just Reform councillors. But again, I have asymmetric information on that because I'm part of Reform. But of course they face threats. Our activists. One of the things that kept me awake at night when I was chairman of this party was the threats that activists face. I mean, people being chased down the street with an axe, for knocking on the door with a Reform leaflet. So the threat is real. We will be looking at all of those things. Look, we've got to start somewhere, and we are starting from a point. I think the fact that you are asking me that question, which is a great question to ask, but then we have to ask ourselves why even serving members of Parliament lack, in our view, anything like the security that they need. Christian Calgi, Daily Mail.
You've listed a number of very harsh statements by politicians in other parties who made various comments about both Anne and Reform, David Lammy, Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips, Ed Davey, Lisa Nandy, Kevin Hollinrake, to name a few. Can you just clarify, do you really see them as having incited the death of Anne Widdecombe? And you've also cited some appalling tweets calling for the murder and violence against your politicians. Do you want to see social media bosses take action? And if so, how do you balance those potential crackdowns with your wider pro-free speech narrative?
Yeah. So firstly, on the free speech point, nothing about what we're advocating for right now is about censorship. Okay? So this is not about trying to clamp down on free speech. What I will say with regards to social media, again, something I take personally, I go onto some of these platforms and in my feed I am seeing threats to kill the leader of our party and my friend. And I'm seeing them repeatedly. And I'm seeing these accounts not taken down. Now, obviously, a threat to kill is against the law. You don't need any new legislation to do that. And whether that's somebody shouting that in the street or on social media, it's exactly the same. And so I would say, if there are threats to kill a politician of any stripe, then I think that does need to be taken seriously. But what I'm not doing here is advocating for more censorship. In terms of, do I think that those senior politicians, or government ministers, or indeed the Prime Minister, incited murder in terms of a criminal threshold? No, that's not the argument that I'm making. But what I am saying is, given the size of the soapbox these people have, that there is a responsibility. And I want to say it again. Of course you can criticise our policies, criticise us. Of course. But I want to repeat, likening us to the most murderous and brutal regimes in history and saying that we are an urgent threat to be stopped is not just hyperbolic, it's irresponsible. And, you know, people who understand what stochastic terrorism is will understand how damaging those things can be, as I said in my speech. If we are this huge supposed threat, if we truly are neo-fascist, as one prominent politician described us, if we are planning on doing all of the things that some of those people have said we would do, and we are an urgent threat to be stopped, then how can we be remotely surprised if there are some people in this country who might take it upon themselves to try to extinguish that threat with lethal force? Tom Scottson at The Sun.
Thank you. So would you like to see taxpayers foot the bill then for security of non-MP figures and those that have never been an MP, such as yourself? Mm-hmm. And would they also receive all around the clock protection? And also as well, would this mean that you would have to pull police officers off the streets to protect MPs as a result of the policy?
Mm-hmm. So to be crystal clear, I'm not advocating for any state-funded protection for myself at all, right? So what we've been scoping this policy are serving MPs and former politicians still active in public life. And again, that will be based on a threat assessment with the caveat here that the threshold of threat for a reform government to deploy round-the-clock protection will be much, much orders of magnitude lower than where they are today. And in terms of the police, look, we've been clear. We need a lot more law enforcement in this country. We need a lot more. There is money, clearly, to do it. I want to reiterate the point. You know, I understand why you might want to ask me about cost. But when the government is saying we're going to spend £40 billion refurbishing Parliament, what is the point of that if those legislating within it are fearful for their lives? It's utterly pointless. So again, I want to reiterate, this is a place where we do need to spend money, yes. And I do not want to see another politician, regardless of party, or former politician, murdered. Nina Lloyd, Press Association.
Thanks. Nigel Farage said he was given the £5 million from Christopher Harborne to pay for his security for the rest of his life. Are you saying that's not enough? And if so, you've just said you estimate round-the-clock security for all MPs would cost £100 million, but there are 650 MPs, so can you just talk us through the maths? Wouldn't you be looking at a cost of upwards of £3 billion? Or with the level of security?
No, look, our press team, we're going to put something out with some of the costings in there. We can go in there. I will say this, though. I will say this. You know, even if you're right and the cost is materially more, it is still important that we do this. Because the counter-argument to that is it is an acceptable risk that something like what happened to poor Anne happens again. Right? And I will go to the wall on that point. We do not have a democracy if our MPs are fearful for their lives or feel like they cannot talk about some of the most urgent issues in this country. And sorry, your first question was?
Sorry, £5 million is not...
Oh, so the gift that Nigel received to pay for his security came before, as you know, he was leader of reform, before he was an MP, before he was even considering becoming an MP. And the purpose of that money was so that Nigel had enough money to not worry about security for the rest of his life. Subsequently, of course, he did run to become an MP. Thankfully, he is an MP. He's obviously he's fighting a by-election now, but became an MP. And just as importantly, he's the leader of Reform UK, and he's in receipt of an extraordinary number of threats. I cannot stand here and say I know he's the most threatened man in Britain. I don't have access to that intelligence. What I will say is based on what I've seen of Nigel. And by the way, those numbers I gave you are since February this year. That 1,577, threats, 597 death threats. This is since February this year. And so it is appropriate, of course, for Reform to pay for security while he has that role. I know I and millions of other people in this country hope Nigel lives a long and healthy life long after he is not leader of Reform UK. And that's when, of course, that money will become really important. Kate Devlin, The Independent.
Thank you. You've said that your policy would be based on a threat assessment. Can I ask who you would get to do that? Because obviously the police and the security services have been doing threat assessments on the threats to politicians since they were being targeted by the IRA. What makes you think that your system would be better? And are you suggesting that your policy would be so successful that no violent perpetrators would be able to get around it?
Yeah, so firstly, nobody could ever make such a promise. No system is perfect. And all we can try to do is minimise the risk that something like this happens again. Look, in terms of the threat assessments, it's not just whether there's a threat assessment, it is at what the threshold is at which point you deploy resources. So, you know, I've got no evidence that the threat assessments themselves, the documents coming back, again, I'm not privy to them, but I've got no evidence that those are inadequate. But what I think is absolutely inadequate is the budget and resource being allocated against that. Because if you're taking from a zero-sum pool that is woefully inadequate, then what you're going to see, I think, is what we currently have, which is a situation where many MPs, Reform and non-Reform, feel incredibly unsafe. And that is the key point. Kate Devlin, The Independent. Oh, sorry. Oliver Harris, Politics UK.
Zia, shortly after Anne's tragic murder was being investigated as an act of terror, you wrote on X that people shouldn't speculate, and if they do, that means to shut up and accept the establishment narrative. Which narrative do you think was being unfairly pushed in the wake of this appalling act? And do you think speculating on investigations by the police broadly is fair? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so no, I don't, with regards to your second question, but I want to elaborate on that point. Because as I said in my speech, one of the things that's really important to remember here, yes, this is politics, yes, you know, it has implications for national policy and our society at large. But Anne was also a dear friend to us. And I'm going to reiterate, you know, aside from the shock and the grief, there was an overwhelming sense of fear amongst the Reform MPs. And so I go back to the original point. What was going through my mind is how would I react if I was in a position to be able to discharge these sorts of resources, state resources. I would operate on the basis that our democracy was sacrosanct. I would not allow it to be threatened. And if there are serving MPs who are colleagues of an amazing woman who had been barbarically murdered, who had outspoken political views that those colleagues often shared, that they felt safe. And I would go to the ends of the earth to make sure that nothing would happen to them. And that's why I took exception to, and again, I read you a direct quote from the government's own counter-terrorism advisor. This isn't just my view. If anything, it was the police. You know, I went on to tweet, it was the police that were effectively speculating. And so that is a really important point here. You know, I think the response was not only inadequate from a security perspective, the pretext for that inadequate, in my humble opinion, I'm just expressing my personal view here, the pretext for that inadequate response was essentially steering people away from the idea that this could be a politically motivated attack, something that seems increasingly likely to have been incorrect. Emilio from Politico.
Hi, thanks. Two questions. Firstly, can you just be clear about who is in scope of this policy? Peers, metro mayors, you talked about hostility towards Andrea. I think it came up earlier. I'm not sure if you were quite clear about it. Councillors, like what politicians completely we talk about. And then secondly, as you'll know, the Parliament rules are that any donations in the 12 months before an MP was elected that might reasonably be thought by others to be potentially influential should be registered. Obviously, the first bit of draft legislation you guys published was this crypto bill, which has now been deleted. Do you not think now, in hindsight, it would have been sensible just to err on the side of caution and just register that 5 million maybe the cultural donations, etc., just to be sure, to be careful, so that you don't end up in the situation you're in now, where you're kind of fighting it after the fact? Yeah.
So in terms of who is in scope, so firstly, all serving MPs, okay, and that they will get under reform government, they will get round-the-clock protection, not based on obviously there will be threat assessments and things could be ramped up. Additionally to that, based on threat assessments, but all will receive round-the-clock protection. Beyond that, we're talking about former politicians who are remain active in public life. That will be based on a threat assessment. We will have more to announce about others. Look, as I said, there are many politicians in this country who I think feel extremely unsafe, and rightly so. But the measures that we are proposing now are a significant phase shift and a big multiplication of current resources being deployed to protect politicians. With regards to your other question, as I said, just out of respect for the theme of this press conference, I'd ask that we stick to the theme of MP security. Dave Burke, The Mirror.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Yusuf. You're absolutely right to say that the temperature needs to be turned down. Will you be telling reform supporters, i.e. the ones you have control over, to be careful about the way they talk about opponents, and would you call for all other parties to do the same? Should all parties have a transparent disciplinary process for cases where people do go too far? Does reform have one? And just if I may, the right way for voters to have their say is through the ballot box. Are you concerned about the electoral threat Count Binface poses to your party leader?
So again, with regards to the second question, we will have people in the media to talk about all sorts of issues, and they'll happily take that question. In terms of, politicians, regardless of seniority and crossing the line, I can only talk advisedly about our own process. We do have a disciplinary process. That disciplinary committee discharges its duties on a regular basis. I do think people can cross the line there, and we do everything we can to encourage reform people to do that. Again, I would draw a distinction between somebody who's working in a branch, for example, and somebody who is the Deputy Prime Minister, for example. So when David Lammy, to use him as an example again, says that Nigel, quote, flirted with the Hitler Youth just days after the government cut his security by 75%, you can understand why a lot of reform people take great exception to that, not least because of the size of David Lammy's soapbox. The number of views and eyeballs that witness that is absolutely enormous. And that brings us to the end of the questions. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.